losing money. Rain it down on the wife and the kids. Rain it down on the house where we live. Rain till you got nothing left to give. And rain that ever-loving stuff down on me.
Do you ever forget to Google things that everybody else seems to understand and then find yourself in the opening moments of a national radio show about to use a phrase that you're not 100% clear about the meaning? No, just me? Okay. So do you remember when the phrase democratic deficit started bouncing around the country not that long ago? Was it sort of referendum-y time, I think? Democratic deficit. I confess I'm not 100% clear on precisely what it meant, but I'll tell you what I thought it meant, because that's the meaning and the definition that we will be working from for the duration of this programme. The thing, what I think it means. I think it meant that kind of sense, or indeed the reality of the distance between casting a vote or having a stake in a democracy and the way that it is run. And I take it a little bit further than that. I think of a sort of almost... It's almost like a veil of ignorance that falls upon voters when some issues of governance are in the spotlight. There's a slightly sort of verbose way of saying, what the flip has happened to the £37 billion that was spent on the so-called test and trace system? Can we decide what we're going to call it? We're not going to call it the NHS test and trace system, because these 1,000 a day consultants, some 2,000 consultants employed on rates of more than £1,000 a day, have no more to do with the NHS's daily grind than you, me and Dick Van Dyke do. I mean, that is, I think, quite a dangerous political shenanigan to try to name it the NHS test and trace, because it potentially creates in the minds of the people, the patients, the voters, the idea that NHS leaders or NHS members or doctors are somehow responsible for this. And if you think it's a little paranoid to warn that right-wing media will do their best to turn you against doctors if they think there's a few quid in it, then you probably haven't been paying attention to the last 2 months or so with regard to GPs, a continuing campaign of attack against them. And then you've got this is a bit Emperor's New Clothes. Not the way I normally mention the Emperor's New Clothes, which is just a roundabout way of boasting about spotting the truth before other people did, and goodness knows that's getting tiresome. But more the thought processes of the people who admired the clothes. What would you do? So the message you'll remember was only very intelligent people, or something like that, can see the Emperor's clothes. Only very clever people can see the Emperor's clothes. If you are not very clever, you will not be able to see the clothes. So you clock the Emperor, and you can't see any clothes, but you don't want to announce to the world that you're not very clever. So you pretend you can see the clothes and wax lyrical about their lusciousness. Or, probably a more plausible reaction would be, I can't see the clothes. I think I'll just keep my head down. I'm not going to stand up and announce that I can't see the clothes, but I can't see the clothes, so I'm probably going to keep a bit quiet about it anyway, just in case anybody asks me to describe them. And I won't be able to describe them because I can't see them. And all of these reactions are built upon the notion that other people can see the clothes. So I think as a younger man, I would have approached this story a little differently, because I would have thought possibly I lack the wit, or I lack the brains, or I lack the conviviality or the fraternal spirit, perhaps, to get my head around how something like this can happen. It might be my fault that I am so befuddled by the £37 billion black hole that ended up being labelled our test and trace system. Could end up being more, could end up being less. I mean, time, of course, will tell. And the report keeps calling it NHS test and trace. So we'll begin, and I don't want to be lazy. Maybe it is an accurate description of it. I don't personally think it's fair, because it sort of loops in doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals, but that's what the report calls it. It's the Public Accounts Committee, again, a committee made up of MPs of all hues and they have concluded that it has been one of the most expensive health programmes delivered in the pandemic, allocating an eye-watering £37 billion over 2 years, although it underspent by £8.7 billion in its first year. Its outcomes have been muddled, and a number of its professed aims have been overstated or not achieved. Do you have assessments at work? Do you have, what do they call them? Is it assessments? Is that the modern parlance? Do you have, you sit down with one of your line managers and you run through your objectives and your goals and you talk about how you're getting on with regard to the objectives and goals that you discussed at the last meeting? Or you have perhaps some bars set that you're supposed to get over? I'll tell you what, Keith, by the end of the year, it would be great if we were hitting all the advertising junctions on time. And if we could maybe aim for an 85 to 90% success rate, Keith might say to me, then that would be an enormous improvement on the absolute skip fire that your junctions often end up being. Although today, I promise, will be different. 9 minutes after 10, or T minus 6 minutes with regard to the first break of the day. So that would be one thing. What else might they put on my list of things that I could improve upon? I know what you're thinking. Hardly, James. You can't improve upon perfect. Oh, stop it. You know, the simple. Well, obviously, audience figures quite a big deal. You know, get yourself over 1 million, and we'll buy you a box of chocolates or something like that. Might be the measure. I don't know what you do. I'll tell you what, I've got a family member works in customer service. Number of phone calls you get through in the course of this. It's a tricky one because the best customer service people in terms of results might spend a little bit longer with that. So there's no point just answering as many phone calls as you can and mugging everybody off. But if you end up on customer satisfaction surveys, absolutely knocking it out of the park, then everyone's a winner. Everybody's going to be happy. We're going to have all sorts of celebrations going on in the workplace. Any job, there are measures in place, right, where you can judge success versus failure, or gradations of success, or gradations of failure. Name a job. Bus drivers. It's a tricky one, isn't it, really? Trying to think. Bus drivers, well, obviously driving your bus successfully and not crashing into anything. Making your stops, but then you wouldn't want bus drivers to rush. So there are lots of things you can talk about in the context of pretty much any area of employment whatsoever. And yet Dido Harding is in the House of Lords. She remains a baroness, just as David Frost remains a lord after negotiating a deal that he has spent pretty much every day since seeking to disown. We'll leave him out of proceedings for today. Let's see how far we can get into the programme without mentioning the blessed B word. It's not, you're very kindly suggesting to me, intelligence that I lack. It's possibly just bluster, a curious combination of confidence and, I don't know what the word would be, entitlement? So there are so many mysteries thrown up from this story. And I'll tell you again, it's on the front page of the Telegraph. So if you still cling to this ludicrous, tribal, self-destructive tendency that is responsible for almost all of our country's ills, and you think, well, you can't trust the MPs, you've got good old Johnson, you can't trust the MPs. This is, as I've said before, and I will say again, Boris Johnson is to the Daily Telegraph as Dennis the Menace is to the Beano. This is literally his fanzine. This newspaper exists almost exclusively to blow smoke up his proverbial posterior. And they have the biggest coverage of this story out of all of them. Test and Trace criticised as eye-watering waste of cash in 1-inch high letters right across their front page. Scheme failed to enable return to normality despite £37 billion funding, says report. It's been an eye-watering waste of taxpayers' money. It did not achieve its objectives. Almost a fifth of total health service funding was used to hire more than 2,000 consultants who were employed on rates of more than £1,000 a day. Just 11% at some points of contact tracers were working, and the figure never got beyond 49%. Do you remember on this programme when we found ourselves in the unfamiliar position of accidentally making news because we took a call or two one morning, I can't even remember what the question was, from people claiming that they were employed by Test and Trace and we're currently doing nothing. The first one or two appraisal is the word I was looking for. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Someone's paying attention. People rang in, one or two people rang in to say, I've been working for Test and Trace for 3 weeks, James, and I haven't taken a single call yet, or I've taken one call in 3 weeks. I'm on duty and I'm on the payroll for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and all I really have to do is move my mouse every now and then to record on some software somewhere that I am both at my desk and in place. 30 minutes after 10 is the time. And I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. I thought, well, if it's true, it's an anomaly or it's an error. If it's true, then it's a tip. It's a an exception to the rule. It's an exception that proves the rule. The rule will not be that thousands upon thousands of people up and down these islands are twiddling their thumbs all day while being paid to operate the test and trace. And I threw out that note of mild scepticism. And do you know what my switchboard did? My switchboard went boom. And we took call after call after call from people sitting at home doing nothing while being paid to operate Dido Harding's test and trace system. That's the name I think we might settle on. Unless you come up with a better one. A lot of you are suggesting Serco, but I don't think that does quite work. I don't know. Performance reviews, appraisals, assessments, call them what you will. How come they don't apply in cases like this? That's one of the questions I've got for you. The big question, and the one I'd like you to answer right now, if you understand a little bit more about this world than I do, the world of government procurement, the world of consultancy, the world of interplay between private sector and public sector, have a crack if you can. And I'm not expecting you to account for every penny of every pound of the 37 billion that have been arguably wasted. But just have a crack at telling me, somebody who isn't thick, isn't ill-informed, is paying attention, but currently has absolutely no idea how this could happen. Not on this scale. £1 billion, I'd struggle to get my head around. £500 million, I'd think, yeah, I could just about see how that might happen. £10 billion, do me a favour. £20 billion, what the hell is happening in our country? £30 billion, what is this? Some sort of corrupt banana republic? £37 billion, and it failed. And here we are. Everybody in charge is still in charge. Everybody responsible for it has waltzed off to the next gig. Every penny has been spent, and not a single word of apology, contrition, or responsibility has been uttered. That I just don't get. But let's look at how the system works. How does the government set the dog running? The government announces, we're doing this thing, it's called Test and Trace. Here's Dido Harding, she's in charge of it. Fast forward 18 months, we're 37 billion quid in the hole, and it was an almost unmitigated disaster. Talk me through how you think, from your perspective of either knowledge or experience or clairvoyance. Clairvoyance, welcome today. How do you think this happened? Explain to me, somebody who should be able to get his head around it but can't, how the hell a figure like £37 billion could ever appear in the context of a story, an event, a moment like this. It's almost too big to contemplate sometimes, isn't it? You know, if an MP was caught nicking 37 quid's worth of food from Sainsbury's, shoplifting, then I'd somehow, the rage that the country would feel, I think, would be more visceral than the idea of the government spending £37 billion of our money on something that didn't work. I really do. You know, if you were caught nicking a box of chicken legs and a bottle of Blue Nun, then somehow we'd be able to marshal our forces more effectively. £37 billion, well, how the hell are you going to blame for that? That could be the second question of the morning. But the first is, how do you think it happens? And you know, broad brushstrokes. No one's going to account for every penny of every pound. But just give those of us who are utterly befuddled by the figures, the scale of this, well, indeed, as the Public Accounts Committee calls it, the eye-watering waste of cash. How you think the baby steps towards understanding how it could have happened. 0345 6060 Don't be shy. I truly haven't got a clue. There's absolutely no way during a conversation on this radio programme that you could be the person that knew less about how this could happen. Couldn't happen out of the two of us. Tom's in Sheffield. Tom, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James. I think you used the correct term there, befuddled. I run a COVID test site on behalf of one of the big kind of 5 facilities management companies. So I think you're also correct in saying you can't call it Serco test and trace because it's not just Serco. It's Serco, G4S, Mighty, Sodexo, all of them.
Okay. But it is, you think, these big service companies, these big private sector service companies whose names should be on the box as opposed to the NHS?
Their name should be on the box. Everything's going unchecked. That's the issue. There's nobody going. So even Department of Health and Social Care, nobody's checking that. Hang on a second. That quote is eye-wateringly high and ridiculous. And there's no reason for us to be paying such a huge, vast amount of money for such a low-cost item. I'll give you an example. We've got 2,300 of these test centres around the country. On my very little site that I manage, I've got a staff of 10 every day, 13-hour shifts, 7 days a week. We work 4 days on, 4 days off. We've got 2 white gazebos, 3 by 3 meters. They're being rented out by the subcontractor, being billed to test and trace for £500 per week each. How
much do they cost in B&Q?
Precisely. You could get them for less than £500 because they're decent quality, but it's not going to be more than £500.
I don't believe it. First call, penny drop.
So if you do the maths, that's £500 per week per gazebo. I've got a very small site. Some of these sites have massive.
Just describe, if you would, in the spirit of Lloyd Grossman, describe the gazebo to people unfamiliar with the setup.
The gazebo is going to be. What you'd see at a food market, that a food vendor is selling.
So it's like a tent with no sides.
It's a tent with no sides. Okay. We've got one.
Gazebo's gazebo is. See, that's why you're ending up paying £500 a week because they called it a gazebo. If they'd called it a tent with no sides, someone would have gone, "Hang on a minute, £500 a week for a tent with no sides? You're having a laugh."
We have one which gets used as a holding pen for people coming onto the site, and then one which is standing empty, just not being used. It's erected. There's no point for it being there.
And that's £1,000 a week to pay.
If you do that maths, that's £26,000 per year on the rental of gazebos.
For one tiny testing site in one tiny corner of Yorkshire.
Exactly. If you multiply that across all the sites across the country, that's about £119 million a year.
So who signs off on that?
Next year.
I know. I mean, even I can do the math.
Department of Health and Social Care.
But who? I mean, I don't want you to name anybody, obviously. But who? Because
DHSC.
Yeah, but does someone come along? Does it cross their desk, or was the message? And I have some sympathy for this in the first instance, because it worked with the vaccines, oddly, didn't it? Giving Kate Bingham a blank cheque, giving her a blankety blank chequebook and pen, and telling her just to go out and buy whatever she could for whatever the cost was. That worked. So there is, as I bend over backwards to try to understand them, the bit that you have where they. They go, well, look, first, no questions asked. Just get it set up, lads. Just do it. I don't care. Money's no object. No?
Exactly. And that's what they've done.
Yeah.
And that's what they do with the Nightingales as well. I was heavily involved there. But you can't continue doing this unchecked. It's time.
But they have for 18 months now.
Precisely, and it's time that
and you're still paying. You're still paying for these gazebos.
Well, I'm being paid to stand around and do next to nothing. We my last shift, we had 46 customers come and get tested. 46.
And how many people are there?
We employ 10 people plus myself. That's 11 on a shift. And that's a small site.
Well, I'm
for 46 tests.
I'm grateful for your honesty. You're almost in whistleblower mode this morning, aren't you?
Oh, don't get me started.
I thought it's too late. It's too late for that, Tom. But there it is. And when I say who signs off on it, I want to know what that chain of command looks like, because somebody somewhere, we heard all the old stories about when hospitals outsourced maintenance contracts and it would end up costing 86 quid to change a light bulb. And I think many of us, Tom, thank you so much, mate, not just for your contribution to the programme today, but for doing what you've been doing for the last 18 months, albeit in vaguely comical circumstances. You'd think, oh, that must be an exaggeration, or the usual people got angry about it without acknowledging that it was a result of their ideological commitment to privatisation and Thatcherism that this problem was occurring. But what would you do? Look, if the boss came in now and said, what are we paying you per show at the moment, James? And I said, well, it's £1. And they said, well, what do you think you're worth? And I said, probably £1 million a day would cover it. And who wouldn't try to get as much as they humanly can from whoever is in charge of the purse strings? What you rely upon is there being somebody in that process somewhere who would turn around and say, have you heard the nonsense he spouts every day? He's lucky to get tuppence halfpenny. That person is obviously Keith. But in most circumstances, if you had an opportunity to squeeze more money out of whoever is paying you, then you would take that opportunity. The easier it is. Some of us are a bit shy about asking. Some of us don't like talking about money. Some of us have got imposter syndrome. Some of us have got low self-esteem. So there's lots of other circumstances. But if you're in the business of squeezing as much money out of a public sector contract, a private sector contract with the public sector that you can get, then you're going to charge 500 quid. Let's just charge 500 quid. What's the worst that can happen, Tristram? They'll say no. Just stick it down. Well, what's the worst? They're going to come back and they'll say, hang on, we can buy them in B&Q for 350 quid. Special prize this morning for the first person to text me with the price of a decent sideless tent stroke gazebo from B&Q or a provider of your choice by the end of the next news bulletin. 0345 6060973. So that's got to be part of it. Remember the way this programme works? If a caller says something that I think is clever and you think is not, ring up and tell me why. Redress the balance. Ian's in South Woodford. Ian, what do you reckon is happening here? £37,000 million, we should say, because that somehow sounds bigger.
Well, first of all, they got the wrong people. They should have got these car insurance people, that find out that I had an accident in the car 2 years ago. They got through to us as we time okay.
I don't want comedy today. I want insights.
No, it's the usual sort of thing, unfortunately, when you get consultants coming in that do it all theoretically, not practically. They haven't got a clue. They go into business after business. You will find they've all gone out of business since. They get somebody, a consultant in, they say, do this, do that. They don't ask the blue-collar workers that do the job. And 2 minutes later...
There weren't any, Ian. I'm familiar with this refrain, but there weren't any blue-collar workers. We didn't have a test and traces, and we were set up from a standing start. I don't want to sound ungrateful, but spare me the well-rehearsed lines about... No, but we don't have blue-collar workers. Tom was not running a test and trace system 2 years ago, was he?
No, but there's people that work for these companies like, for example, Tesco, Sainsbury's or anything else that do it all the time.
But do what all the time?
They actually set up systems that say, right, we've got to get this stock in this place, or this sort of track what's being sold in stores. But these people didn't have a clue.
But that wasn't the problem here, I don't think. And I'm not making excuses for them, but nobody... It's not as if there were things... Yeah, here we go. No offence, but it's not the same as what happened to you years ago.
No, wait to what I say.
Well, I can't. It's the news.
I used to supply quarts with fax rolls.
Yes.
And I was selling them at $1.99. HMSO was supplying the same ones at £12.
Yeah.
And it just
that was the last call, though, wasn't it? That wasn't about the personnel. That was about being overcharged for goods and chattels. No, I know, I get that. I mean, this internal nonsense, internal market, call it what you will, is clearly part of it. 129 quid on Amazon for a perfectly nice gazebo. There you go, and you can rent it back to Test and Trace for 500 quid a week. Nice work if you can get it. Guess what percentage? 691 million lateral flow tests were sent out. Right, 691 million. Guess how many had results reported, which is what the test and trace system was supposed to do. So you test, you get a positive, you report it, they trace everybody that you might have come into contact with. I've got that right, haven't I? Yeah, that'll be £2 billion, please. Guess what the percentage was of the 691 million lateral flow tests sent out that had results reported? Yeah, 14%. 14%. And of course, we don't know whether how many of them were reported negative. And the continued reliance on the overpriced consultants who, quotes, delivered, end quotes, this state of affairs will by itself cost the taxpayer hundreds of millions of pounds. It's from the report, the Public Accounts Committee report. This is unbelievable. And yet it is true. So it's unbelievable in the sort of Victor Meldrew sense of the word. And I'll tell you something funny. Stephen's up next and then Amrit. But I have got some phone lines free into the studio, which is quite rare at 10:36, thankfully, these days. But it's also very interesting. I'm becoming a bit of a student of the switchboard, because I now like doing the topics where I don't think you're going to ring me. We did one last week, which almost designed not to take calls. And then we ended up taking 2 or 3 brilliant calls from people who really knew what they were talking about. It was about online harms and what you can actually do once you move beyond the headlines. And one caller in particular, Suki, had actually been very heavily involved in the policy making. And if you don't know that much about it, then you've almost got nothing to say. So, all right, it's filling up a bit now, but there's still a couple of phone lines free, which is rare for 10:36. But I'll tell you what's full to the absolute chocker. Is my inbox with people reporting back on gazebo prices. So if I'm sitting here thinking, oh, that's a worry, there's 2 phone lines free. That's not normal for the first hour of the programme. Maybe no one's listening today. And I don't think, just glance at my inbox. And gazebo. So that sort of restored my faith in the size of the audience, but not my faith in the system. I don't think you could buy the 189 quid one off Amazon. Chris in Devon tells me a commercial gazebo, 3 metres by 3 metres. And commercial will probably mean heavy duty, won't it? Or slightly hardier than the one which Dee tells me you could get for 65 quid from Argos. So, yeah, no offence to anyone. I buy stuff from Argos all the time, but usually you pay more. So when Chris's commercial gazebo, 400 quid plus VAT, is yours to keep forever. And they're paying 500 quid a week to rent them per week. And this is going to be part of the issue, but it still doesn't answer the question of how does that happen? So how does this happen? They're paying 500 quid a week to rent gazebos that probably cost that to buy outright. Okay, but how does that happen? You answer one question. It's like chopping off that beast from Greek mythology. You chop one head off and 2 more grow back. But thank you to everybody who has done that. And thank you also to Keith, who has looked into renting one for reasons I'm not entirely clear about. But even if you were to rent one yourself, 4.5 metres by 3.5 metres, 115 quid a week plus that. So you're sitting there thinking, why would you rent one for 115 quid a week? Answer, you didn't know how long it was going to last, maybe, when it started. You thought it might be over in a month. So you're just going to rent it and that would end up being roughly the same price as buying one outright. But you're still paying 500 quid a week. A year after it started? Houston, we have a problem. Stephen's in Marlborough. Stephen, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Stephen.
I had my first contact with Track and Trace yesterday.
Fantastic. That would be £463 million, please.
Yeah, when both myself and my wife were pinged to tell us that we had been apparently in contact with somebody on an unknown date. The system doesn't even tell you the dates that you may have been in contact, but does then go on to say you now need to self-isolate for 10 days after the contact with the person that you don't know who you're in contact with.
Yes.
Okay?
So you don't know when to start it from.
So you don't know when to start it from. So you fill in a link and it then tells me that I don't have to self-isolate because I'm fully vaccinated, but then to go off and have a test, which I did within an hour. In fact, we both did within the hour. We then asked the lady at the check-in at the test centre, did we now need to self-isolate? And the answer was, I don't know. So we both had PCR tests yesterday. We're both awaiting the results. The ironic thing is that we both had PCR tests last Thursday because we came back from a few weeks in Cyprus last Wednesday. So we got our results back on Friday to say we were all clear, and we can only imagine that somebody that was on the plane.
Yeah.
But 3 weeks ago, you had to have a test before you got on the plane.
Which is
and now you don't.
Listen, this is good. I wouldn't open with it necessarily, but it's still good. The problem is this: if I say how has this nonsense happened, and your answer is here is some more nonsense, it's not really answering my question. Here is some more evidence of how bad everything is. So have a crack at the why of it, the wherefore.
Right. I think the bigger a project, the less oversight there is of it. So you see major, I guess HS2 is probably a good example that one end of the line.
Well, no, because it is going to get built, isn't it? I mean, unless the train sets off on day one of HS2 and never arrives at its destination and is never seen again, then the parallel, perhaps, with the test and trace isn't entirely fair.
I have zero confidence that the northern section of HS2 will get built because they'll run out of money before they get to that
Do you
stage.
remember? There's a joke about the Channel Tunnel, or was it true? And they started digging it at both ends, and someone made a mistake, and they were going to go past each other.
Can I just say one more thing about gazebos?
Fill your boots, yes. Gazebo Hour on LBC.
Right, so where we were staying in Cyprus was opposite a public car park, and there were two gazebos which were in the corner of that car park, which we think were there as an emergency testing station. And in 2 and a bit months, we didn't ever see anybody under there.
500 quid a week.
Well, probably a bit less than that over there.
Well,
but
10:41. That's Stephen. Thank you. Welcome home. It's still pinging. I didn't even realise that. Should have asked. I mean, what's the point of that? One MP's already reported positive for COVID. I told you on Monday this would start happening this week. And then I also said in the same breath, I wonder whether they'd actually tell us. But one fella reported positive for COVID after being in the House of Commons not wearing a mask. So theoretically, doesn't that mean everybody he came near should have pinged? However convivial and fraternal they may have been feeling. That's, of course, if they've got the app up and running. I've got that CV. I had one of those clips. Didn't go mega viral. Just did about 50,000. You want to go mega viral these days? You've got to explain the growth properties of concrete. That's the. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it. Thank me later. The CV that Private Eye put together of Dido Harding's career. You know me. I'm a little uncomfortable with ad hominems or even ad feminems. But sometimes, in answer of the big questions, you've got to look for the little details. And the fact that this woman was in charge, despite having had a career, it would seem to me, of really spectacular failure, may well be part of the answer. So I'll run you through that CV again shortly. But first, Amrit is in Nottingham. Amrit, what can you tell us?
I was just listening. I was reading in the newspaper today about the government of the 37 billion. The point I want to make is that the government is the party of business.
Well, it used to be. But Boris Johnson kind of rebranded as the party of... Have you got the beep? Have you got the bleep, Keith? Have you got the bleep? No, we haven't got a bleep. Can you do the bleep, Amrit?
Beep.
Thank you. Yeah, bleep business. That's the new Conservative brand.
But they're meant to be kind of commercial thinking individuals, in theory, right? People who may have worked in some kind of consultancy-type project in industry. Yet these are the people who presided over a £37 billion disaster, quite frankly, based on the reports. So I think there's a inconsistency between what they claim and what they are capable of doing.
Well, I think you're right, but account for it to me, because I got to 44 minutes into the programme without mentioning the B word, and I'm very, very close to announcing it to explain the unhitching from business of this government. Traditionally, they would pay attention to what big business leaders had to say, but post B word, they're listening to people like, Digby Jones and Mr. Weatherspoons. Instead, and I don't know whether that's relevant. I want why do you think they failed?
I think,
why didn't they take advice from the people that they take all the money from? That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Because personally, I would want to know what were the salaries that were paid out.
£1,000 a day. £1,000 a day for 2,000 consultants.
I've read somewhere that some of the consultants were being paid £6,000 a day. That was in the Guardian today.
Some of them will have been. Some of them will have been. The numbers, I think, are coming from the Public Accounts Committee. So people, still somehow clinging on to this programme, but who are of the view, that was in the Guardian. Can't believe a single word that they say.
But the question is then, what was achieved for that?
I don't know. Why are you asking me? I've dedicated the entire show to how little I know.
I don't know.
I know nothing.
I just think this is just... It's like you've got people like Dido Harding, who was, questionable work previously in the company where she worked in terms of what happened there in terms of data release. And you just think this is... They're trying to portray this as a public service, but underneath it all was a bunch of private companies like G4S, Mighty, etc. What was the relationship between the government and the people working in these contracts? Serco,
Deloitte, Citel, Randox, Amazon, TransUnion, the Army at one point were on standby, or they were paid for and operated mobile testing units until last July when they were handed over to an unknown commercial operator, I think. Sodexo, Boots, all of the G4S, all of these companies had a piece of the action. And the NHS, they just got rinsed for the cash.
Yeah. And they put all of this was done by the private sector, but the branding on top was all the NHS.
45 minutes in, still haven't got a Scooby-Doo. Apart from, of course, the gazebo question, the gazebo conundrum, the gazebo file, which, if you expand it to account for everything that was paid for from the public purse and invoiced for by the private sector, you're probably pretty close to touching the sides of the 37 billion quid. You know, I was thinking about Ian, an earlier caller, the one who probably came closest to getting the bear with the sore head treatment from me at about past, for suggesting they got the wrong people in, just because I thought it was a bit too obvious, a bit too glib. In retrospect, I can hardly give other people a coating for not having answers to the questions that I haven't got answers to. But I was at the British Kebab Awards last night, and I met some amazing entrepreneurs. And I mean, the way they spoke, this was the bit that I wasn't expecting. The way that they spoke about their businesses was really inspiring. I mean, genuinely inspiring. These are people who really were at the top of their game by dint of being at the British Kebab Awards, and they really wanted to win. And their pride in winning, I mean, the pride in just being there and being nominated, but the pride in winning, I spoke to, several, actually, about a dozen different teams of business people and staff and chefs. The lads at the Ottoman Donna on Cannon Street in London E1 being particularly good examples of this. Such a passion for what they do. They weren't just sort of saying, "Oh, can we have please come to our restaurant, try our kebab." And so the lads, the restaurant in Brighton as well, down in Brighton, the name for the minute eludes me, but if you're listening, boys, and you text it, I'll read it out. I promise. And that's what I think perhaps Ian was suggesting when he talked about getting the workers in. You want people who took had the knowledge and took a real passion and pride in what they were doing. So here is our challenge. Our challenge is to get the best test and trace system in the world. And then you just ignore the voice in your ear that says it doesn't matter whether it's any good or not, because Boris Johnson is going to describe it as the best in the world, right up until the point he stops talking about it entirely. Right, put that on the list, of course, the fact that there was no clarity or leadership from the top, and they wouldn't actually be held to account by the boss, so to speak, if things went wrong. So that, I think, was what Ian was driving at, and he's right. I know this sounds a bit silly, and I had a wonderful time last night, so I'm probably a little bit rose-tinted spectacles. But if you could have transported the flair, the spirit, and the enthusiasm from the British Kebab Awards last night and put that lot in charge of the test and trace system, I'm fairly confident things would have gone a hell of a lot better for a lot less money. 10.52 is the time. Just briefly, one of my ideas was always, if you're on the procurement side of it, incentivise people to get low prices. I know this sounds a little bit obvious, but if it's my job to get hold of 1 million gazebos, right, you're in charge of gazebos, Keith, what's the first thing you're going to do? Right, okay, I'm just going to get some gazebos. By the way, the more money you save, the bigger your bonus. I don't know how you'd prove that or how you'd construct that, but it should be obvious, shouldn't it? A bit of incentivization in the public sector instead of all the incentivization being in the private sector. The number of people getting in touch with me to say, I used to work in widgets and they'd cost us £1.20 a pop to make, and we'd flog them to the Ministry of Defence for £12. I used to work in this, I used to work in that, rubber seals, whatever it might be. It's just absolutely commonplace. It's not funny anymore. You know, the jokes about it costing 50 quid to change a light bulb. It's not funny. It shouldn't be happening anymore. But here we are. 10.53. Caroline's in Croydon. Caroline, what can you tell me?
I just wanted to say, James, that I was part of a very small cog in the wheel of the test and trace system. I was a contact tracer. Well,
I'm not going to hold you personally responsible for the entire £37 billion, Caroline. Do not worry.
That would be lovely. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
But I do resent the fact that everybody is saying that contact tracers sat at home and did nothing. I was actually really, really busy all the time. We were taken on, I'm a nurse, and I was taken on via the NHS professionals. So all the contact tracers who were speaking to people with confirmed cases were actually professional people from the NHS. And we were put in place so that if...
There were different levels, weren't there, of test and trace operatives, and you were clearly at the top level. So I'm glad you're here. I'll let you continue to set the record straight on that element of the story. But it doesn't cancel out all the people that have rung me to say I did nothing for a month.
No, I appreciate that. But right at the beginning, there had to be people in place because they didn't know how many people were going to call or how many people were going to be confirmed cases. So you had to have a certain number of people in place. And like with everything, if it doesn't grow as quickly as you thought it was going to be, people are going to be sitting around at home doing nothing. But suddenly, when it all took off, as I say, I was busy all day, every day, speaking to confirmed cases. So the people that were calling the contacts of the confirmed cases were people who didn't necessarily have professional experience. But I just found that members of the public just did not want to engage with us at all.
So you were putting in a shift, but to little avail.
Well, yeah, because people just would not answer their phones. And we would leave a message saying, we are calling from the NHS Test and Trace Service. Please answer your call when we call next time. We would call them up to 10 times and people just would not answer their phones. And therefore, we weren't able to speak to their contacts because we couldn't find out who they were. So it just made the whole system, because if you think about it, if you've got to call somebody 10 times, you need 10 times the number of people to make those calls. And as I say, I was busy all day.
So that explains the ramping up of the costs.
Well,
not all of it. I did say I wasn't going to hold you personally responsible for that. But hang on, I'm just trying to knit together, join the dots of what you said. Because you had to do that 10 times, that someone else, they'd need to pay more people. If every phone call was answered first time, then you'd have fewer people needed to make the phone calls.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Of course. But and then when you did ring people said to me, well, it doesn't bother me. I don't care what's going on. I'm not giving you my contact names.
Yeah.
And then that meant that you had to employ someone to go round to their house. So a lot of this was because the public just would not engage with the test and trace service.
Yeah.
And
why not? I know this isn't your field of expertise, but to be honest, you could have got paid $2,500 a day for not knowing why they weren't engaging with it either. So what would you have done different? Because other countries had much more success in this field than we did.
I can't
do that humph again, will you, Karen? Just do that, because that speaks volumes. Go on. Oh, there it is.
I think it's the public psyche in this country. I just think people feel that they don't owe anything to anybody else.
So we're back to the mask wearing, really. That curious impulse of.
But one stands out in my mind particularly. One gentleman said to me, "What benefit is this to me? Doesn't benefit me in the least if I tell you who
what's
my
in it for me?
are."
What's in it for me?
Yeah, what's in it for me? But could I just say that every day there were different things on the system. They were updating the systems all the time. They were bringing in new ways of doing things. They were making it a different way to contact people. They were doing it where they changed it from us pressing our mouse every 15 minutes, because obviously they had to start somewhere to where it actually gave you your contact all the time. So they were in that system all the time, updating it, revalidating it, just making sure it was working better every day. And I find it really annoying that everybody's sitting at home thinking the test and trace system didn't work, because from my point of view as a contact tracer, I just found that the public just were not engaging with this. Obviously, not everybody.
No, it's a really powerful point. It's a really powerful point. But that goes back then to my refrain throughout this period. While you were busy working on the test and trace, I was busy begging for some clarity and leadership. And clarity and leadership is the only thing, really, political leadership, that could change the public attitude.
But James, I thought clarity. You were told if you had symptoms, you went and got a test. If your test was positive, you would be contacted by the test and trace system.
No, you weren't. You might think you were, but other people thought they were being told that they could rely upon common sense. Other people thought that they were being told they could carry on shaking hands with people because those words came out of the Prime Minister's mouth.
Yeah, but people...
No, I know. I wish it wasn't so. The message was there, but it was obfuscated and confused by the people that were supposed to be in charge of getting the message across the country. That's a matter of record, not a matter of opinion.
But even when I told people why they had to stay at home and isolate, that they needed to tell their friends and relatives and anybody that they'd been in contact with, they just didn't understand me.
No.
People just did not understand.
And that is a failure of clarity in leadership. I like your generosity of spirit, the idea that the information was there if you needed it. But when you're simultaneously being told to rely on your common sense as a direct alternative to relying upon the official advice and the regulations, then you are doing untold damage. And that's before you even start shaking hands with COVID patients and boasting about it on national television. Thank you, Caroline, and I'm glad you got the chance to set the record straight. I see why you felt aggrieved at the representation of the system when a lot of its failures, I mean, for me, go back to the top of the pyramid and also to the consequences of that absence of leadership on public behaviour. First rule of journalism, never become the story. So I'm very, very, very sad to tell you that our friend and colleague Rachel Venables has broken that rule in spectacular fashion. Reported in today's Daily Express. Hard-working LBC correspondent Rachel Venables reports, "Folks, I'm done. I just got a reply to a Freedom of Information to the Department of Housing addressed to Mr. Terry Venables. On seemingly being confused with the former England and Tottenham football manager, Rachel playfully remarks, 'Good to see El Tel suddenly taking an interest in cladding, I suppose,' before more suspiciously speculating, 'Were they trying to be funny with a nickname I wasn't meant to see? I confirm I signed the original correct request with my actual name.' Well, how much to just introduce Rachel as Terry with a completely straight face next time she's in the studio on a non-mega serious story. Just now we're joined by Terry Venables on the line from Westminster. 4 minutes after 11 is the time. I've seen that. It's very funny. Very funny. Looking at why 37 billion quid gets thrown in a hole. How? Why? Does it happen? Caroline, a great caller, reminding us that some of the responsibility is actually ours. Always quick, aren't we? Point the finger. I blame the government. Government clearly very responsible for this, but equally, it's your fault. If you were getting the call and not answering it, if you got the call and ignored it, if you didn't hand over your detail, all of that arguably adds to the overall bill. And the bit, I'm just looking at the date on this, July the 9th. LBC releases a tweet that says, Baroness Dido Harding insists that NHS Test and Trace is a success, blaming negative public opinion on bad press. I.e., it was all the journalists' fault that people thought it was rubbish. James O'Brien responds by scrutinising her CV, something I may do again today, actually. And I think she remains, here you go, for satire fans, she remains head of NHS improvement until the end of this month, when she's stepping down, I believe, voluntarily. The woman in charge of a £37 billion programme described by the Public Accounts Committee as an eye-watering waste of money currently rejoices in the job title, Head of NHS Improvement. There are some days, aren't there? No, where do you go after that? What do you do next after that one? And as this text points out, James, you had the entire outdoor events industry sitting on its backside during this whole period with all the equipment to set up testing stations and to hand and a wealth of experience of site management. I don't know, I thought you'd made a mistake there, so I read it out wrong, but actually your English is perfect. With all the equipment to set up testing stations to hand and a wealth of experience of site management. 500 quid a week, first call, Gazebo Gate. Gazebo Gate, we're going to call it, Gazebo Gate. 500 quid a week to rent a gazebo that you could buy for less than that. 18 months, 500 quid a week, you do the math. 6 after 11 is the time. Still room for you to answer these questions. Mark's in Budapest. Mark, what have you got?
Basically, the first thing is Dido Harding's husband is a Conservative MP, if I remember.
What's that got to do with the price of tea in China?
The world is called nepotism. I've spent 30 years working in emerging markets. This is just like in African Republic, what's happened to the UK. All the usual suspects, all the accounting bodies pile lots of people into projects. Deloitte piled 1,000 people in with no medical experience, no knowledge at all, what we call body shopping, £1,000
What does that mean? What does the body shopping mean?
Body shopping to me means people who are very clever, with a degree, etc., 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 good brain, and you just put them into a position which they've got no experience of doing, and you just put them in there hoping to create something, hoping to create a structure. That's what we call body shopping on that level. Okay. And it's a common practice among a lot of audit firms that they'll do this on large projects.
But if it's such a rubbish practice, why is it still commonplace?
Because they're always very close to governments, these parties, Deloitte, obviously KPMG.
But they must make the bulk of their money in the private sector.
Yes, they do. But whenever the government comes calling, that's when they make the real profits.
That's just you. We don't know that. That's just what you think.
No, we don't know that. But when you look at the amount of money that Deloitte made on this,
so what you're suggesting is, stop mentioning Deloitte if you would, because you've got no evidence to back up the accusations that you're making, and the same goes for nepotism. But we can work with the broader brushstrokes of what you're suggesting. What you're suggesting is that these consultancy companies, or consultancy companies like this, operate a two-tier system, and the service they provide to the private sector will be unrecognisable when compared to the service they provide to the public sector.
You would say that, yes, because also
that makes sense to me.
They've got to perform.
Also, they're going to have it checked at every turn. They're going to say, how much are you spending on those widgets? And then they say, well, hang on a minute, Keith's just been on Google. He's found those widgets for 27 pence from the shop round the corner. And yet in the public sector, no one's doing the Keith widget check.
There's no KPIs, key performance indices. There's no measurement technique.
I mean, you call them key performing indices. I call them Keith. There's no Keith. There is nobody saying, why are you paying that for your widgets? I've just found one in Argos for 69 quid, says Keith, for example. And we're having fun with it, but that is what you're suggesting. In the private sector, you send in one of these consultancy companies, they're judged by how much money they save you. It's why every time a consultant turns up in a newspaper office, we all reach for our sandwiches wrapped in a roadmap, because we know that half of us are going to be chucked out the window by tea time. They're saving money. When you call in a consultancy to the public sector, they're just in it to make as much money as they humanly can. Do you know, I don't normally like glib scenarios, Mark, but this one seems to fit the available evidence, doesn't it?
I've seen this in many countries. I've worked in emerging markets for years.
You said,
and this is exactly what you see in what you would say. I've worked in Nigeria. I mean, that's full of things like this.
Except with the added layer of I come in, I get paid a fortune in public money, and I give some of it back to politicians. And
that's how you define the word consultant.
Well, it's not happening here. No one is alleging that. It's you might come away with a peerage, but you're not going to come away with a wheelbarrow full of moolah. I don't know, though, when you start moving into the area of donors. I mean, not in the kind of things I was raving about last night, but donors with an O, DONOR. I guess you could probably dress it up as a form of kickback, although not as egregious and not as transparent as the ones in the so-called banana republics that Mark refers to. It is a bit of a mystery for me when I'm in charge. Lobbying and consulting in the part. And isn't that odd that the two big stories politically this week are Owen Paterson taking 3 times his MP's salary to lobby on behalf of private companies, and he's got himself into a whole heap of trouble for doing that, and consulting. How much of this 37 billion quid has been weed up a wall on people pulling down enormous salaries for doing next to nothing? We do not know. We may never know. And we should know. We want a proper audit, but then you have to call in a consultancy like the ones that got the gig to do the audit, so they still walk away with a ton of cash. That's what I meant by the democratic deficit. We sit here. What are you getting cross about today? Has someone stopped taking the knee again at the football? Are we going to get cross about that? Or the Insulate Britain protesters? We're going to get cross about that. They're changing street names again, are they? Oh dear, that's awful. And then this stuff just goes on. Just like a merry-go-round. And, I get cross about it today. You get cross about it today. Mark gets cross about it today. Forgotten about it by the end of next week. I'd forgotten about Dido Harding's CV. I'd forgotten that she was still head of NHS improvement. I'd forgotten that in July she claimed that it had been a success. And it was our fault, the media's fault, that the public had such a low opinion of it. The magnificently named Shuggy is in Barnet. Shuggy, what have you got?
Hi, mate.
Hello.
I'd like to say that the whole thing is sadly founded on that sad triumvirate of greed, nepotism and corruption. I've got direct experience of this. I worked in a large civil engineering project.
Don't libel anyone.
No. I'm not going to tell you who they were. I'm not going to tell you who they were.
Good.
And although there were 3 levels of management, so CEO, chairman, and others, and I can't be specific, but there were 3 changes of CEO, 3 changes of chairman over the 6 years I was there, primarily because everyone who was involved thought they were going to get a knighthood or some sort of gong out of it.
That's the difference between a wheelbarrow full of cash.
Yeah. But the point I'm making is that at one point when I finally left, the chairman was a really close buddy of someone who was at board level.
Yeah.
That person was signed off the PhD of someone else who was appointed. So they all knew each other. They were all chums. And this has been going on for a very long time.
I don't know. I'm a bit naive on this, because I often imagine being a lot more important than I really am, Shuggy. It's a bit like winning that. What would you do if you were in charge? And actually, I might hire Keith to come and do check the prices on Argos, even if I was the head of a FTSE 100 company, because I know him and I trust him. So, listen, I know I went to the kind of school where the old school tie cliche comes from. So I know I'm possibly blinkered.
Yes, as did I.
Well, then but it's not nuts, is it, to go with people that you know? And we don't have to call it nepotism. So the fella, I think, was it Mark, who talked about Dido Harding being the wife of a Conservative MP. Johnson appoints her because he knows her and he thinks that she's...
Yeah, but when they're demonstrably incapable of doing the job.
That is a bit of a fly in the ointment of my defence, I grant you.
If you cast your mind back to the 80s, there was a
it was acceptable in the 80s.
No, there was a scenario for Ernst & Young, Capgemini,
Steady.
as was,
Yes.
and Arthur Andersen, as was.
Yeah.
Well, on this, the concept of universal patient login, where you could go to anywhere anywhere in the UK and log in, and get an appointment, get a hospital appointment, get a doctor assigned, and all the rest of it. Yeah, it was abandoned after $3 billion went down the drain.
Now, here's the thing.
Now, the thing is,
Go on.
the point I'm making is that. You, me, and everybody else you know has got a card in their pocket where you can go to a hole in the wall anywhere on the planet.
Yes.
And it knows who you are, where you live, how much you've got, how much you're allowed, when, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. What's the difference between that and a card where you go to a doctor's clinic anywhere in the country?
That's a question I shall be asking in the future. Here's the thing then, again, in my own sort of slightly clumsy way, trying to knit together all of the strands of conversation that have popped up today. In the private sector, so no one's going to get punished at the companies you mentioned for that failure, because they're £3 billion to the good, right? So they're not going to be held. No one carries the can there. In the private sector, whoever was on the commissioning side, whoever was on would their feet wouldn't touch the floor. You've spent what on what? You're off, mate. You're finished. You'll never work in this town again. But in the public sector, that never happens.
Well, you would think so. You would think so.
Yeah, I'm getting there.
The trouble is that politicians, time and again, are caught with their arms shoulder deep in the till, trousers in a puddle round their ankles, and they go, oops, ha ha, and they carry on.
What a poetic turn of phrase you possess. And what else do we have if not poetry at times like this? This may be the answer to some of the mysteries thrown up by the conversations we've been having. Pippa writes, my MP is a, quotes, consultant, end quotes, to a number of firms mining gold and precious metals outside the UK. There are no mines in his constituency. He is not a mining engineer. He works, again in quotes, in inverted commas, he works a small number of days a year for these firms for which he receives thousands per hour. So if, like me, part of your problem this morning has been thinking, well, why do politicians allow this to go on? Why aren't they clamping down like a ton of bricks? Answer potentially is, and nothing illegal or corrupt in any of this, but they see a piece of the action. You know, they and I guess in its worst examples, it ends up being an Owen Paterson type case where he currently faces a 30-day suspension for the House of Commons for having been found to have behaved in an exceptionally bad manner while drawing down enormous sums of money from private companies and lobbying on their behalf to government. So why, whither, wherefore, Dido? Let's have a look at this. Just get this right. I don't know if I'll read it all to you. I'll just gauge whether or not you're getting bored. But Private Eye, which is such essential reading at the best of times, but particularly during reality challenging times like this, put this together earlier this year. 1995. After a stint as a trainee management consultant at McKinsey, 27-year-old Dido gets her first proper job, marketing director, no less, at Thomas Cook. Thomas Cook spends a long time contemplating its navel, an exec from a rival firm tells Marketing Week. It is in character for it to recruit a consultant rather than a doer. Harding takes the criticism in her stride. It is common, she says, for consultants to be thought of as eggheads who don't know what they're doing. I want to prove I can do things before the label sticks. Fast forward to 1997, and in an interview with the Travel Trade Gazette, she essentially makes a virtue of her ignorance and says, I am not ashamed to say I do not know the travel industry as well as my colleagues, but in a team I think I bring a new perspective. That's really interesting. Because, you know, Mark's saying they bring in consultants in the idea, the hope, the fingers crossed that they'll do something different. But this is the private sector, remember, so not all of my analysis of his contribution holds. 1998, Private Eye reminds us that when she was hired, Thomas Cook said Harding would be, quote, look at the future for the business in 5 to 10 years' time. But after 4 years, she's off, moving to Employment Services Group Manpower as Senior Vice President, Strategic Marketing Europe. God, that's going to be a big business card. 1 year after that, she's off again, 1999. She heads off to Woolworths to become Commercial Director. And less than a year after that, she's off to Tesco as Commercial Director for Value-Added Foods. So the CV now has got a lot on it, but she's not, as far as I can tell, done anything. 4 years later, 2004, still at Tesco, she's now International Support Director, responsible for its overseas ventures. The previous year, she told The Guardian that she hopes to still be with Tesco in 5 years' time. So, 2007, she's off, goes to Sainsbury's. March 2008, she starts work as head of Sainsbury convenience stores, but not for long, because in 2009, she becomes chief executive she announces that she will become chief executive of TalkTalk in March of 2010. So she starts at TalkTalk in 2010. In 2011, TalkTalk incurs a £3 million fine from Ofcom for sending thousands of customers inaccurate bills. The firm then has to shell out a further £2.5 million in refunds. During her time at TalkTalk, she twice wins the Daily Mail's Wooden Spoon Award for providing the worst customer service in the UK. So the CV's getting fleshed out now with actual substantive achievements. 2 Wooden Spoon Awards for providing the worst customer service in the UK. 2014, her old mate from university, David Cameron, makes her a baroness. That swings and roundabouts, isn't it? 2 wooden spoons for providing the worst customer service in the country, 1 peerage. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Next year, cyber criminals access the financial and personal details of more than 150,000 TalkTalk customers. You'll remember this if you were one of them. And when asked whether or not the data had been encrypted, the chief executive, Baroness Harding, sighs, the awful truth is that I don't know. So that was in 2015. Remember, back in 1997, when she was working at Thomas Cook, she said, I am not ashamed to say that I do not know the travel industry as well as my colleagues. So this is epic ignorance of the job that you're doing, dressed up as somehow consultancy insights. It is, at least from where I'm sitting. You'll remember that 100,000 customers left TalkTalk and the profits halved. 2 years later, 2017, she leaves. Now, what sort of job would you expect to get after presiding over epic levels of appalling customer service, halving profits for the relevant years, seeing 100,000 customers leave and not even being able to answer a question about whether or not the data that had been stolen by cyber criminals was encrypted or not? What job? Go on, think of a job. She becomes chair of NHS Improvement, responsible for overseeing all NHS hospitals. Guess what, though? Hands up, our Dido, always honest about how much she knows. She tells MPs, I have not worked in health and social care and would be the first to admit that I have a lot to learn about the sector. That's the 3rd time. You would have thought somebody at this juncture would have gone, I mean, she's great. She's got fun, old Dido. She can keep her peerage. Let's hire someone that knows a bit about this business, shall we? Let's roll the dice, lads. Let's take a risk on someone that's actually got some experience in this sector. Or, God forbid, somebody who's won awards for good customer service, maybe, instead of people who've won awards for bad customer service. I do not know how this world works. That's me speaking, James. She also airily rejected the MP's calls to resign the Tory whip while holding what should be an independent post. And then along came COVID. So, Track and Trace Supremo, you'll remember, then off to head the new NIHP. Matt Hancock, remember him? Dismisses MP's mutterings about her lack of health credentials. We're there again, assuring ITV News that she has excellent experience. Excellent experience. Indeed. What happened to Thomas Cook and Woolworths? Anybody off the top of your head? How have they performed in the intervening years? So there it is. I mean, there is perhaps the largest part of the answer to the question of how the hell did this happen. And as recently as July of this year, she was claiming that it had all been a big success and it was all the fault of those nasty journalists for saying mean things. And I am told but filed this under speculation rather than a reportage. I'm told that if Matt Hancock had still been Secretary of State for Health, she would have been in with a very, very good chance of getting the big job as Chief Executive of the entire NHS when Simon Stevens stepped down. That was my information. One of the first things Sajid Javid did when he got into the job was to pull the rug from under that idea. Sharpish. So make of that what you will. I'll just give you the facts. Arthur is in Liverpool. You still awake?
Yeah, I'm here.
What do you want to say?
Following on from what you've just said, I was a nurse for 45 years. I've retired. I worked in the NHS from the 70s onwards. And the NHS has always had the infrastructure, resources and skills to deal with infectious disease control.
Yes.
There have always, especially since the epidemics of HIV and MRSA in the 80s and 90s, right. The contact tracing, which already existed in the NHS, was expanded dramatically. Every hospital trust will have had microbiologists, nurses, all experts in infectious disease control, contact tracing, treatment of patients in isolation, and so on. That was expanded with community support, and I've got experience of having worked with infection control teams right up until shortly before COVID. So there was all this NHS infrastructure, expertise, knowledge about how to manage infectious disease, stop it spreading, controlling transmission. And it seems to have been completely bypassed by the government when COVID came along. I think they saw COVID as a massive opportunity to divert public funds into their mates' pockets. Obviously, pardon?
Do you really? I mean, you're comparing what could have been done with what was done and trying to come up with a rationale for what was done, and your answer is a merry-go-round of money. And it's hard to... I mean, I'd like to argue with you because I live here and I'm patriotic and I'm a taxpayer, but 37 billion quid's worth of money says you're right.
Any rational government would have known that there was a pandemic coming because the evidence was coming out of Italy and so on. And they would have said, right, get all the infection control expertise, which we have huge amounts of within the NHS.
Yeah.
I mean, these people, this is their job. They will have planned for epidemics and pandemics of
people like John
Ashton
were talking about this on Question Time in the earliest days of the
absolutely
conversation, and being shouted down and actually coming under attack in some corners of the media.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, draw those experts together into some subgroup within SAGE, and just roll out a plan because there will have been a plan.
Whereas they saw it as a commercial opportunity.
Absolutely.
You've taken me up to the news, Arthur. I apologise, but I wanted people to get the full majesty of Dido Harding's career record.
I just want to say also the app was exactly the same thing. They saw an opportunity for a massive data grab, which they could flog off to Peter Thiel and Palantir and all that lot. Our health data, when Apple and Google are actually doing... If Apple and Google are doing something, you're a customer. You buy from them.
Yes.
You don't do your own thing.
No, I don't. I mean, again, and I think, again, the example of other countries supports not necessarily the suspicion about what they were planning to do with the data, but certainly the comparison of what we ended up with to what other countries ran with under the Apple and Google banners, and the comparisons in performance.
The most complained...
Yeah, you get a takeaway delivered. What is the most thing that you're thinking of... What?
The polystyrene.
Who complains about the polystyrene?
Well, if you've got green credentials...
You're going to get your dinner delivered, or you're going to phone them up and say you've delivered it in polystyrene.
Cold.
What's you talking... What?
It's cold?
No.
It's late?
No.
I don't know.
Soggy chips.
There we go.
Soggy chips. Just stay there a minute. Philip's in Old Sodbury. Philip, I just noticed that you were still on hold and I've started talking about soggy chips. You must feel slightly neglected and probably slightly insulted.
Slightly.
Yeah, I can only apologise. What were you hoping to talk about on the Great British Radio Show?
It's about government contracts.
Yes, go on.
A number of years ago, for my sins, I was involved for about 5 years in supplying quite expensive equipment to the UK MOD. Now, in any project, you've got to imagine it as a triangle. And within that triangle, there are multiple smaller triangles. The guy at the top is the prime and all the subcontractors underneath. Now, when you're dealing with a government entity, you know beforehand that you're going to have to jump through numerous hoops. You've got to fill in paperwork. All of this has to be paid for. Right. So something that is available commercially at, say, $100,000 to, in my case, it was the Merchant Navy. Yes. When you start selling it to the MOD, you're inflating it by about 3 times the price. You've got to supply spare parts for 20 years. You've got to fill in God knows how many forms. If there's suddenly an emergency, say you're building a battleship, which was the case with the equipment I was supplying.
Can I hurry you slightly? If you can bring it in a minute, we'll be golden.
And the government says, well, we want this battleship yesterday. Yeah. Something has to give. Now, normally, in all of these triangles, there are checks and balances, which, they're beating you down on price, they're having you filling in forms, and things progress at a snail's pace. Get rid of all that to deliver something immediately, and all the inflated prices start not only aggregating, but compounding. So you end up with something, what would normally cost, I don't know, $500 million would end up at $37 billion.
And so there is a sort of ineluctable logic to what's happened, coupled perhaps with some fairly egregious incompetences or skewerings. But I think, and we are going to run out of time, it's fair to say that Kate Bingham proved that you can actually have someone at the top of the top triangle who can keep a lid on everything.
That is competent management.
Clarity and leadership.
Fast. It wasn't required. Well, it was required fast, but they were in the hands there of the
they could only buy it once it existed, so it wasn't quite the same equation as having to put something up which we did actually need yesterday. Philip, I'm glad that you were hanging on the line.
There's one more thing.
I can't. I've got the Prime Minister waiting to do his PMQs in the House of Commons, Philip.
Okay. All the Venables look the same. That's what I was.
Are you one as well? Are you one as well? I like it a lot. There we go.
Easy money. Rain it down on the wife and the kids. Rain it down on the house.